Prevention in airport security is the difficult task, obviously, and the long pole in the tent is having enough information and intelligence about individuals when they may be sympathetic to terrorist groups, may be activated, may be supporting those groups, and trying to find ways of ferreting out who those individuals are. I think part of the challenge is to continue to do security checks to ensure that people are not criminals, they're not engaged in terrorist activities, and aren't jeopardizing security. That requires ongoing monitoring, ongoing security checks, and background checks of all those who are touching the aircraft and airport security. What concerns me with this case is it underscores again not only the vulnerabilities of airport security, but the potential that you have a terrorist sympathizer able to bring down an aircraft based on his own actions and in a lone wolf fashion. We've often talked about lone wolf actions involving somebody in a truck or using a gun. This is a scenario where one can imagine one individual bringing down an aircraft in support of a terrorist cause. That's really what worries me here. It's incredibly difficult to have ongoing, persistent background checks on everybody that's in an airport, but you have to apply some degree of scrutiny to ensure that anybody that's inside the perimeter of airport security and has access to actual aircraft have a right to be there and aren't a security risk. Even if he didn't intend to bring the plane down, the compromise of the safety feature on the plane certainly was problematic and could have caused problems if the pilots had not been alert. At the end of the day, we don't want terrorist sympathizers or supporters working on our aircraft or inside airport security perimeters.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.